Yeah, I got it. Just gonna wait a couple more minutes. I've got to make things go live online for people watching. So as soon as the clock ticks to 11, then I'm gonna hit the live stuff for Facebook. Have like one open, one closed. Okay. Okay. Well, if you have one door open, one closed, you know, people can still come in, you know. Cuts down a little bit on the noise. All right, so I'm gonna go live on Facebook now. All right, so everything's live now. We're good to go. Thank you all for being here today. My name is David Bennet. I'm the curator of maritime history here at the North Carolina Maritime Museum. And today we're going to discuss the historic fisheries of the Neuse River, primarily going to be discussing the 19th century. As we go through this talk, you know, if you have any questions, I'll pause every once in a while to give you all the opportunity to field a few questions, but just wait until I give you that opportunity. It'll be at the end of each section. So I've got this talk divided into 3 sections. So I'll let you know when I'm ready to take those questions. What's going on here? I think I'm having a little bit. Oh, there we go. All right, so just some quick geography. Since we are talking about the Neuse River, I just want to throw this map up here, indicating where the Neuse River Basin is located. So I'll just get my laser pointer. And of course, it's this area right in here is the Neuse River Basin. And then, of course, there's the other major river basins of North Carolina shown there on the map. Here's a more detailed map specifically of what the Neuse River Basin actually looks like. And as you can see, it goes pretty deep into North Carolina, draining into the Pamlico Sound. And here's a list of some of the major tributaries. These are not all of the tributaries of the Neuse River. It's just a handful, really. But the major ones are the Eno River, the Flat River, Little River, Trent River. Contentia Creek is also a major tributary. It's a huge creek, and it used to actually be classified as a river, but it's reclassified as a creek today. And then these are all the counties that it cuts through or borders. Primarily what we're going to be talking about, though, is Carteret, Craven, and Pamlico counties. So the counties that are closer to the mouth or at the mouth of the river. If we were to go deep into North Carolina, we could be here all day talking about it. But the bulk of the commercial fishing industry on the Neuse River was really done in these 3 counties, although there's commercial fishing that was done all the way up to Goldsboro. So I'm going to start off with the antebellum time period, because that's really when the commercial fishing industry on the Neuse River starts. And I'm not going to start the story in Craven County. I'm going to start it in Carteret because I want to talk about sort of Isaak Lewis and his life. And that's sort of the framework that I really kind of want to talk about the fisheries on the Neuse River in the 19th century. And the reason I want to look at Isaak Lewis is because he lived from about 1812 and he died in 1895. And so he was there right at the beginning of the commercial fishing industry. And then he's going to be there as the industry starts to peter out for the American shad industry. And so Isaak Lewis is actually a native of Carteret County. He's born on Shackleford Banks. He's the middle child. He has 5 siblings, and he's born in the middle. His father dies when he's about 8 years old, and his uncles die when he's 13. And he came from a fishing family, and he learned how to fish, commercially, probably around the Core Sound, Middle Sound areas where he would have been using dragnets, gill nets, seines, that kind of thing. Around 1836 is when he would have moved to the New Bern area, and he would have been around 24 years old. And shortly thereafter, he married and started a family. And so this is what the area looked like at the time. It looks different than it does today, the borders. Pamlico County didn't come around till 1872. And so Craven County really dominated the mouth of the Neuse River there. Carteret County didn't share a border with it at that time. And this is what New Bern looks like at the time. This is a sort of a layout of the town, and that area with the red box is approximately where Isaak Lewis bought a house. And that's approximately where he lived, in the downtown area. And one of the reasons why Isaak Lewis came to my attention is because he is noted as being one of the first commercial fishermen, professional commercial fishermen on the Neuse River. And there's a federal fisheries report that talks about this and says around 1840, but it's probably about 1836 is when he went into business, and he's credited with introducing the dragnet, bringing the dragnet from Carteret County to Craven County on the Neuse River. And so the dragnet is basically, it's a net where you've got a team of guys working out in the river. They're usually going to land this net on a shoal or a sandbar, and you got usually 2 to 4 guys, and they're dragging the net through the water, catching the fish. They'll plant a stake in the bottom, and then to sort of secure it, and then they'll bring the net around in a circle, and they'll gradually make this pocket pictured here smaller and smaller, and really kind of condense the fish into a smaller area by just pulling the net out, cutting it out. All the while, they're trying to hold the net down with their feet so the fish can't go under the bottom of the net. And that's called footing the net. But anyways, once you get, the fish corralled, then you bring your boat up and you start bailing them into the boat. So gill netting was also very common during this time. It's likely that Isaak Lewis and other fishermen were gill netting on the Neuse. There's actually a law that was passed in 1826 regarding gill netting in Core Sound and the Neuse River. And they talk about having to pull up your stakes by April 15th. The stakes used for the purpose of fishing. And what they're alluding to there is more than likely stake nets, which are just gill nets that are anchored in place with a stake rather than an anchor like fishermen use today. And the reason they would have picked April 15th was because that would have been traditionally the end of the American shad fishery for the Neuse River area. And so the major fish that I'm really going to be talking about a lot throughout this talk is the American shad, which is a food fish, not to be confused with menhaden, which I know, locally, a lot of folks here call it shad, but two completely different fish. This is the food fish. And for the longest time, the American shad was one of the most valuable fish in North Carolina's commercial fishing industry. At one time, it made up over a third of the value of fish landed in the state. Also, the herring was also very important. It was a staple of diet for many people living in eastern North Carolina. It was also an important source of fertilizer for farms. So traditionally, the American shad and herring season on the Neuse River usually started about January and ran till around mid to late April. Some years it would go into May, but usually things were wrapped up in April. And as I mentioned, herring especially is being used as fertilizer on farms. Anything extra that they couldn't save or sell or process was considered offal fish, and that was going to be used as fertilizer in the fields. So herring and shad, not only were they important, food source for just regular folks, but it was also important food source for slave plantations in North Carolina. Is a cheap food source, easily accessible, and better than feeding people corn and rice all the time, but had to have some protein in the diet. And most plantations along the Neuse River, as well as along areas like the Albemarle Sound, the Trawn River, the Cape Fear River, many of these localities had plantations along the riverbanks, and many of them had fisheries for this very reason, not only to provide fish for the households, but also the slaves that are working the fields. And a lot of these fisheries tend to focus on small creeks and the riverbanks of the Neuse River above New Bern, where the river really narrows. And so these fisheries were worked heavily by enslaved watermen. And we don't really know how many there were, but we know there was a lot. And the masters of these plantations would give handwritten permits to these slaves for them to go out and fish independently on the water, and then to go to places like New Bern to sell their catch. And we know quite a bit about this because in 1831, there was a petition formed by residents of Craven County who were upset because there's so many enslaved watermen catching fish and going into New Bern, selling their fish that was interfering with some of the other locals' business. And they went to the legislature and he said, you got to put a stop to this. And the legislature said, no, we're not going to do that. We're just going to allow this practice to continue because we don't quite have the reasoning, but we can assume that these watermen, enslaved watermen, are a central part of the business of these plantations. And we do have some references to the early fish market in New Bern. There's this one letter that was published here by James Bryan to William Graham of New Bern, and he wrote, "Our market is most abundantly supplied with fine shad and oysters, these fine sea vegetables, as our sailors call them." Then in 1848, you have the arrival of the large Holstein fisheries on the Neuse River, and these fisheries were going to be located below New Bern. It was Robert Felton and Elijah Felton of Perquimans County, very, very wealthy plantation owners, owned lots of land, lots of slaves. They come down seasonally to the Neuse River and have this big fishery where they've got these massive nets that are 1,000 to 1,500 yards in length. Same style of fishing that's done up on the Albemarle Sound is now being done on the Neuse River. And so it's a big development in the fishery. And so, and this is kind of what these fisheries would have looked like in this drawing. You've got these two boats that would go out, they'd pay out this giant net in a big semicircle, and then they would haul it into shore. And you have to think of these nets like being sort of these moving fences that just push all these fish like shad and herring into the shore. And so Elijah Felton, the fishery that he was renting land from the Philip Pipkins plantation. It was on the south side of the Neuse River next to Ishmael's Landing. I don't know exactly where this is located because the names of landings and points of land have changed so much over time that it's really hard to pinpoint this location. But we know it's below New Bern. And he had a 10-year lease on the property that ended in 1858. And he paid his rent not in cash, but in fish. So 6,000 herring and 400 white shad, not that much fish to the household of Philip Pipkins. And any offal fish, so any extra fish that they couldn't have that was going to be used for fertilizer, that was going to go to the landowner. And the landowner was also permitting him to cut down trees on his property to, for firewood, to build buildings so they can process their fish, any barrels they needed, they cut up wood for that, and any access to any cart paths that went through the plantation property so they could cart their fish off to New Bern. Richard Felton was renting land right next door to Elijah Felton. Same sort of deal there. Same sort of access to firewood and ability to build buildings and access cart paths, that sort of thing. Then there's also other fisheries that start to pop up where locals in Craven County are starting to emulate the Feltons. And so you've got Noah Gaskell and C.P. Crawford. They have a fishery just below New Bern that they are trying to start up in 1848. Then they decide in 1849 that they're going to try and either rent or sell their fishery. Obviously, something probably didn't work out for them. These fisheries were really expensive to develop. You had to clear beaches because you had all these trees that are growing right up to the water, and you can't have anything that's going to cause a snag for your net, or you're going to tear these giant nets that are expensive. You have to have the space to process your fish, to land your nets. There's a lot of labor that also go into these fisheries as well. Then you had William Bailey, and he had a business partner by the name of Oliver. They had a fishery as well. This other advertisement here has them going out of business in 1849, and you can see they list all the gear that is going up for sale. 1,500 yards of net, big wholesale nets, 10,000 corks, 2,400 yards in lead line, which that's what's going to hold the net down to the bottom as they're dragging it through the water. And then 2 boats, one that's 35 feet long and another that's 25 feet long. And these are going to be the boats that are used to, put the nets out in the river and haul them back. They'd only used 1 year of a 5-year lease, so they're also trying to sell off the other 4 years of that lease. And then what's also really interesting about the bankruptcy papers for this fishery is that not only did they list all the people, well, all the businesses that they owed money, but they listed all the employees that they had on the books that they owed money as well. And there's 30 different men, they're all white men, that they owed money to. And so then I was able to kind of, look in the census to see who these people were. And they're listed as being fishermen, boatmen, farmers, laborers, etc. So just because you're, going to be fishing commercially on the Neuse River doesn't mean that these men were primarily identifying as fishermen all the time. Sometimes they're identifying as boatmen, or mariners or laborers, and sometimes these guys are just farmers who are going to be fishing during the shad season, and they're going to be farming the rest of the year. So it gets really complicated to figure out how many fishermen there actually were on the Neuse River. But these are what these boats look like, those ones that are putting the seines out in the river, and the ones that were up for sale with this last fishery we looked like. And this is actually a more detailed, more accurate drawing of what these boats would have looked like. They would have been pretty wide towards the stern so they could hang their nets and pay them out as they went through the water. In the 1850 census for Craven County, they list 6 large wholesale fisheries, most of these being below New Bern, with quite a bit of money wrapped up in them. Today, this would be tens of thousands of dollars. and investment, and more than 40 men working in these fisheries. And not to mention, there's all these gill net fisheries that are going on, all these dragnet fisheries, and other fisheries that are also taking place besides these big hull seines. And then you have William Dunn is also auctioning off the gear for his fishery. So 1852, he's gone out of business, more than likely, or no longer wants to be in business. Henry Whitehurst, he's an interesting case. He had a fishery on the Upper Broad Creek, which is just below New Bern, drains into the Neuse River. And he had a big hull seine that he sold off. 2 boats, 2 log canoes. These aren't dugout log canoes like Native Americans had. These are multi-log boats, or like your cunners. And I'll show you a picture later on in this program. But his problem was cash flow, not with his fishery, but with his other businesses. He was a big merchant in New Bern, and a lot of people owed him money, and they didn't pay up, and he owed a lot of people money, and ultimately he went out of business and lost everything, not just his fishery. So as the commercial fishery is coming about in the Neuse River and it's progressing and these things are getting bigger, you're seeing people popping up to support the commercial fishing industry. They're selling equipment to the fishermen, like Lewis Lee here, 1847. This is probably one of the first ads for nets that pops up in New Bern. 1848, he's got a big shad seine that's manufactured in Boston that he's selling off. And then you've got George Fisher, who also winds up owning a fishery. He winds up being a representative for a Boston-based company that is selling fishing gear to people in the area. Arin Taylor, he's also a merchant out of New Bern selling to these fishermen. So there's a big business that's arisen. 1860, oddly enough, there's no large fisheries listed for Craven County. And I don't know exactly why that is. I haven't been able to figure that out. And it's kind of weird because, but I'll get to that. There's a quote here that talks about in 1857, the North Carolina fisheries for 1857 have proved a disastrous failure, and several proprietors are selling their beaches at auction. The immense destruction of the ova of the shad and herring being carried into the field as fertilizers of the soil has doubtless been the main cause of the failing of the run of our fish. So in other words, there's too many of these female shad and herring that are bearing eggs that are being caught before they can get upriver to spawn and reproduce more fish. They're all being caught up and put in the field as fertilizer. So here's why it's weird that the 1860 census didn't mention any fisheries, because you've got a fishery that's up for sale. You've got it's right around the confluence of the Trent River and the Neuse River. So where present day James City is located. It's owned, formerly owned by George Fisher, that one merchant who's selling nets. And then there's this advertisement. Giles Haynes, he's a major fish dealer out of New Bern. He's advertising their shad up for sale at the Spring Garden Seine, which was a big fishery. And I'm not sure why it didn't get listed in the census. Can't quite explain it, but they're still active. And then I haven't been able to locate all these fisheries, but this is where, you know, most of the fisheries that I've mentioned are located along the Neuse River. And so Isaak Lewis also possibly got into this big fishery. In 1856, he purchased a small piece of land on the north side of the Neuse River at the mouth of this little creek called Smith's Gut. And the land's really too small for farming. And so being a commercial fisherman, it's more than likely that he was fishing from the shoreline, given that he had a home in New Bern and everything. So do you have any questions about this antebellum period? The rise of sort of commercial fishing on the Neuse? Yep.
Yeah, David, did you find anything out about how long these cotton nets would last? You know, cotton, these were not.
Yeah.
Monofilament.
Yeah, no, they're not nylon monofilament. So for anyone who's listening online, yeah, so the question is, how long did these cotton seines last. And not that long, what you had to do was you had to, whenever they were used, you had to take them, if it was in, especially in freshwater, you have to take them out and you'd have to lime them and salt them and dry them out so they wouldn't go bad on you. And a net might only last like that, might only last you a year or two. If you're able, if you're diligent, some of these big seines are also tarring them as well. So, but your gill nets, those are definitely being limed and salted. Yeah, I want to say though, these big hull seines are being tarred because they were on the Albemarle.
Second question, to preserve and sell these fish, were they salted? And if so,
Yeah.
do you know anything about where that quantity of salt came from?
So the question is, how are they preserving fish? And that's through salting. And there were salt works here on the coast. There's I think Moorhead and New Bern, but Moorhead and Beaufort both had salt works. And then there was salt also being shipped from up north, as well as other points in the state. But salt does play a big role in the Civil War. So any more questions? We'll just roll into the Civil War now, because that's an interesting time period. So here's an image of the bombardment of New Bern by the Union Navy in preparation for the capture of the town, which did fall pretty quickly. The Confederate forces didn't really have much of a chance because they were vastly outnumbered and outgunned. So it was in March 1862 that General Ambrose Burnside captured New Bern, and it was occupied by Union forces. That's Burnside pictured there. And things get really interesting really quickly in New Bern, because by October 1862, New Berns were faced with having to take an oath of allegiance to the federal government of the United States. And if you chose not to, then you needed to leave. Kind of tough situation there. A lot of people left, and they moved either outside of New Bern to like farms in Craven County, or they moved inland to Confederate occupied territory. There's also large refugee populations quickly picked up in New Bern, which is very important for the future. Many of them are runaway slaves seeking refuge in Union occupied territory. Also, you have also a lot of Unionist North Carolinians. North Carolina is divided between, especially Eastern North Carolina, between Confederate and Union sympathy. A lot of people in Eastern North Carolina, slave owners included, did not want to see secession because war is bad for business. And you know, a lot of these businesses in Eastern North Carolina, naval stores, Serpentine lumber, depended heavily on trade with the North. And North Carolina was one of the last states to secede from the Union because of that. So one of these major refugee populations is called the Trent River Settlement, now today known as James City. It actually became known as James City in 1865, but this was really a refugee camp for African Americans seeking refuge in Allied or in Union territory. And this really winds up becoming a huge source for the future of the commercial fishing population on the Neuse River. But here's what New Bern looked like approximately in 1864 during the Civil War. As you can see, a lot of trees in New Bern, not as heavily developed at that time. So this is where the salt plays into our story. So as we mentioned in the questions and comments, salt is pretty much essential for preserving not only fish, but other meats like pork. And salt was in short supply during the Civil War, and the Union military had direct control over the distribution and the availability of salt in New Bern. And if you wanted to buy salt, you had to get a permit that was signed by this man, Edward Stanley, the Unionist military governor of Eastern North Carolina. So there's two governors of North Carolina during the Civil War. You had your governor up in Raleigh, And then in Eastern North Carolina, you had your Unionist military governor who had control of Union-occupied North Carolina. And in order to get that permit to buy salt and salt your fish and pork and whatnot, you had to give an oath of allegiance or neutrality. So needless to say, a lot of people, just so they can eat, are going to either be it, pledge allegiance to the federal government, or they're at least going to be neutral. So the sale of fish in Craven County also became heavily regulated, and that's to do with price gouging. So this influx of all these Union troops who've got ready cash to pay for goods, the merchants and fishermen, they're like, we can make some money. And so they more than doubled the price of fish. And then all the local civilians, they complain to the military authorities and say, we can't afford to buy fish. And so by January 1863, the military steps in and they institute price controls, maximum that you could charge for oysters, for mullet, herring, shad, etc. There is these pretty stringent regulations on prices, but there's also regulations on sanitation regarding fish in New Bern as well, which is pretty interesting. So the fisheries are, disrupted by occupation, but there's ongoing activity going around outside of New Bern where all these fisheries are located. In March 1864, the Spring Garden fishery was raided by federal troops who wanted free fish, and they scared all the fishermen off. And then they stole all the fish and, went back, had good fish fry in New Bern or whatever. And then so Union forces control the south side of the river. The north side of the river is pretty much a no man's land that's not controlled by Union. And there's a lot of Confederate guerrillas present. In 1864, Edward Paris, Martin Broughton, and a handful of other guys who are going to operate their fishery on Upper Broad Creek are kidnapped by Confederate guerrillas and forced to go on a march, carrying all their fish with them to go feed these guerrilla camp. These guys get tired and they jump the Confederate guerrillas, wrestle their weapons away, and they're able to escape back to New Bern. So, it's not safe to actually go fishing on the Neuse River because, on one side, you got to worry about Union troops. On the other side, you got to worry about Confederate troops and guerrillas. But also in 1864, there's this yellow fever epidemic that just swept through the area and really just made life difficult for everyone. And people really couldn't go out fishing. And so those two stories that I mentioned where those federal troops are is indicated right here with this blue star. And then this red star is where those Confederate guerrillas tried to kidnap those fishermen. So, and Isaak Lewis comes up again. He has an interesting Civil War story. So his son, James Lewis, who's also a fisherman, decides to go off as soon as the war kicks off to go fight with the Confederacy. Well, Isaak and his wife, they write all these letters to their son, imploring him to come home. He comes home sort of begrudgingly, just in time for Union troops to roll in and take over New Bern. And as soon as that happens, he's off back in the Confederate Army and fights the rest of the war. And supposedly, Isaak Lewis was bitterly disappointed by this development. I don't, and there's claim later on, there's claims that the Isaak Lewis was this lifelong, loyal, this guy loyal to the federal government, refused to take up arms, although he was a bit older by this time period. What his political leanings were, we don't really know. He could have been pro-Union. He might have just been wanting to be one of these guys to go fish and feed his family. We don't know. What we do know, and where we get all this information about him, is because by this time in his life, he'd accumulated enough wealth to purchase a schooner called Mary Frances, which probably what he was doing with this schooner was he was fishing out in the river, and then he was using that probably as a run boat to get his fish back to market to New Bern. And then in the off season, he could have been running turpentine, lumber, agricultural products, other things to subsidize his income. It would have been quite profitable to do. Well, federal troops, they take his vessel and don't know exactly what happened, but it wound up sinking in the Neuse River, and he was out $2,000. Also, towards the end of the war, his wife died. We don't really know what happened there, but so there's a lot of loss that this guy went through during the war. There was a silver lining to the Civil War in North Carolina, and that is that the shad fishery that was going into a decline due to overfishing was given time to bounce back and recover and be sort of better than ever. Is there any questions before we jump into reconstruction? Yep.
Where did the salt come from that they used to preserve the fish?
So a lot of times with these salt works out here on the coast, they're drying out seawater to extract the salt that way. That was one of the ways they're getting it. Any other questions? Okay, so now we're going to jump in the Reconstruction, the New South period. So after the war, Isaak Lewis and other fishermen are able to go back to fishing. His son survives the war, comes back home, goes back to fishing. Goes back to being a fisherman, and they're trying to financially recover from the losses sustained during the war. And there's this idea of possibly raising the Mary Frances, his lost schooner. It's at the bottom of the Neuse River. I'm not sure if it actually happened, but we do know that he decided that if he did raise it, he was just going to chop it up and dry out the wood and use it as kindling. And James Lewis is interesting. He eventually gets out of being a fisherman and he transitions into being a fish dealer in New Bern. Also, there's a lot of change that happens due to the Civil War. You have this big demographic change. Now, I mentioned earlier they have all these enslaved watermen. We have really no idea how many there were on the Neuse River during this time period. In 1850, 3% of fishermen were Black, and these were free Black fishermen. They weren't enslaved. 1860, there weren't any. In 1870, 61% of Craven County fishermen were Black. So I think that gives us possibly a better idea of how many, fishermen, Black fishermen may have actually been on the Neuse River fishing in the antebellum time period. So quite a large number. And many of these fishermen, if you look at the census records, they wound up coming out of James City. That refugee town, sort of colony that turned into a town. So with everything going back to business, people were a little hesitant because they didn't really know what was going on. There was some breakdown in communication, but in January 1866, the mayor of New Bern came out and said, everything's back to normal, trade's back to normal, bring your fish, bring your boats back. You don't have to worry about the military interfering too much. And in 1866, you have 40 fish dealers. 1867, there's 12 fish stands. Not really sure how many fish dealers there were, but there was a lot of changes that are happening. The city starts passing all these ordinances. You had that all of a sudden have a license to sell fish and shellfish. You had there's these quality control standards, and if you violated them, like if you sold spoiled fish, there's a hefty fine associated with it. And they were also trying to sort of condense the fish dealers into a small section of the city because there are complaints about the smell of fish. So they're just trying to contain it to one part of the city. Also, it seems as though there's some sanitation rules that were instituted by the military government that got incorporated into city ordinances, possibly, or had been the inspiration. Another new development, almost as soon as the Civil War is over, is northern investment in North Carolina's commercial fishing industry. A new class of settlers have poured into the state. They are, for the most part, active, energetic men who believe in developing the resources of our good old state. Her vast forests, her rivers, her fisheries, all furnish an ample opportunity for safe and profitable investments. So this is North Carolina wanted northern investment to help the state recover from the devastation of the Civil War. In fact, they had a bunch of publications that went out. North Carolina Geological Survey, they're putting out all this information about the many resources of the state, including fisheries, to try and attract outside investment into the state. 1869, resources of North Carolina. And this says presented to the capitalists and people of the central and northern states. Again, they're advertising and trying to sell North Carolina to the northerners to get them to move down here and invest in its natural resources. Then you had a guide to capitalists and immigrants, being a statistical and descriptive account of the several counties of the state of North Carolina, and this one's for Eastern North Carolina. So again, trying to get these northern capitalists, and they're saying in this particular publication, the numerous sounds, lakes, rivers, and creeks teem with an inexhaustible supply of food for the sustenance of human life. And so after the Civil War, this Reconstruction time period, the commercial fishing industry just explodes. It gets massive on the Neuse River. By 1873, there's approximately 2,000 nets between the mouth of the Neuse River and Goldsboro. And once you get above New Bern, the Neuse gets pretty narrow. And because of that, in 1875, the North Carolina legislature has to start regulating the commercial fishing industry, because these nets that are above New Bern, they're able to practically choke the shad and herring from getting farther upstream, and actually causing overfishing. And gill netting is pretty much confined to the area below New Bern, where the Neuse is much wider, and the fish are able to some of the fish are able to get around those nets. But they're doing this out of a concern already for overfishing, only 10 years after Civil Wars ended, and they're already concerned about overfishing. So some of the big name fish dealers out of New Bern that are really able to facilitate the expansion of the commercial fishing industry, not only on the Neuse, but elsewhere in the state, are men like Augustus Nelson, Benjamin Lane, Frank Augustine, Charles Watson, Thomas Daniels, George Ives, Daniel Bell, and John Royal of Morehead City, which had extensive business dealings in New Bern and along the Neuse, as well as Calvin Dickinson. And so I'll speak specifically to sort of these big three. Thomas Daniels, he's a northerner. His story was he's actually a British immigrant that came to Massachusetts with his family when he's 8 years old. When the Civil War takes place, he joins the Union Army and he gets stationed out of Beaufort. Well, during the war, he falls in love with a local woman, a Willis, and after the war's over, he doesn't go back up north. He stays in Morehead City. He gets into commercial fishing. In the early 1870s, he and his family moved to New Bern, where he goes into the wholesale fish business, and he becomes wildly successful. A sort of something that's kind of interesting is he goes into business in New Bern with Charles Watson, pictured here. Charles Watson was an officer in a Confederate artillery unit. And together, you know, it's sort of odd couple. You've got this Union infantryman partnering up with this Confederate officer after the war, and they just become wildly successful. And then you've got George Ives, another northerner. He was from Connecticut. In 1874, he moved to New Bern, or not to Beaufort. He moved to Beaufort. He's credited with introducing the Sharpie to North Carolina. He introduced the concept of shipping fresh fish and oysters on ice. He started the scallop industry in North Carolina. He's a really, really influential guy. And in the late 1870s, he moves to New Bern as well. And then I don't have a photo of Daniel Bell and John Royal, but here's an ad for their business. So they're into selling all sorts of stuff. And then this is the prime area where these big fish dealers were located in New Bern. This is in the sort of Trent River area. And this is what, it's kind of like a not so busy day. That sort of looks like, kind of, this is what the area looks like when it's dead. And then this is what that same area looks like when they're busy. And you got tons of boats in there delivering fish and shellfish to be sold to these wholesale merchants. And these big fish dealers, they're either buying or they're renting these big wholesale fisheries on the Neuse River, above and below New Bern. Augustus Nelson, he owned Hog Island. There's more than one Hog Island in North Carolina. Yeah, there's a Hog Island that's off of Cedar Island here in Carter County, but there's also a Hog Island on the Neuse River above New Bern. He owned that island. He bought it in the 1870s. Daniel Bell and John Royal, they rented a couple of beaches in the 1880s. Daniel Bell, John Royal, and George Ives all went in the business together and bought a seine beach in 1882. And George Ives, he rented a variety of beaches, and he bought one, or he owned one from 1904 to 1910, sold it, and then turned around and rented it for 5 more years. So you've got dealers that are fish dealers that are actually, running large aspects of the commercial fishing industry on the Neuse. And this isn't where all of these fisheries are located, but it's, most of them. Some of them, like I said, are kind of hard to pinpoint, but just to give you an idea. But the seines weren't just limited to these dealers. You had these ordinary sort of independent fishermen that are operating them as well. In the 1880s, Isaak Lewis had one near the confluence of the Trent and the Neuse Rivers, right around where James City would be today. Another independent fisherman, John Wood, he had a seine above New Bern at an area called Wiggins Landing. And then J.M. Ward, he rented Hog Island after the death of Abe W. Nelson, and he eventually bought it from his widow, from Nelson's widow. And so just to give you an idea about how many of these nets are actually out there and how big they are, the ones below New Bern, they're the big ones. They're probably 1,000 to 1,500 yards in length. And then the ones that are above New Bern are much smaller, 150 to 300 yards. And as you can see, there's quite a few between New Bern and Contentia Creek. So that's going to be past Kinston. And then really from Contentia to Creek to Goldsboro, there's fewer. But there's commercial fishing all the way that far up the Neuse River. And then this is a map from 1906. So you've got the Neuse River broken up into sections, and these solid white dots, those are where these whole seines are located. So this is where it starts with New Bern right here. And then this is your next section, followed by this one, this one, and this one, and then this one. And then it's carried over onto another page where, these go all the way up. I think the Goldsboro area, or close to Goldsboro. So not a ton of these seines by that time, but just a map to give you an idea. Another thing that's really being pushed by the fish dealers is pound nets. Pound nets wound up in North Carolina shortly after the Civil War. A couple of guys brought them to the Albemarle Sound. They were Civil War veterans. They were from the Pennsylvania, Ohio area, fished on the Great Lakes. But the pound net gets to the Neuse in 1878, and it's the likes of Daniel Bell, Thomas Daniels, and George Ives that own these nets and are using them, and they're employing men to work these nets on the Neuse. And they're really between the mouth and Trent River. And just how these nets work, you've got this one long section of net here. It acts like a fence. It's called a leader. And so the the fish run into it. They want to get around it. And so they'll go up the length of it, and then they'll get into this next section. It's called the heart. And that narrows down into this area called the funnel or the tunnel. And then that leads them into the pocket or the pound. And once the fish get in there, they can't get back out. They're alive. And so the fisherman just has to come in there and bail them out of that part. And so you got this nice fresh fish, unlike a gill net where, you know, the fish will get stuck in the gill net, it'll die. With a pound net, the fish are alive when you go get them. And so these, you know, some of these pound nets, you know, they can just be a leader with just one pocket, or you can have another leader come off the heart like here, and you can have a whole network just off of one of these things. And so these things can get really big and they can get really complicated. The average leader on the Neuse River was 200 yards, so 2 football fields long, going out into the water. So Craven County, they didn't quite care for the pound nets there, and they passed laws against them. And we got this quote here that talks about it. In 1889 and 1890, the regulation against their use appears to have been enforced, no pound nets being reported in the returns for those years, but a few were introduced in the lower part of the river, closer to the mouth, where local sentiment was favorable and evasion of the law gradually extended. So what was going on here was Craven County was enforcing their pound net laws, and their fishermen were abstaining from using them by 1889. The people who weren't abstaining from their use were the fishermen from Carteret County, because what had happened in Carteret County was they passed a law that banned pound nets in the areas like Core Sound and, you know, Bogue Sound. And the folks in the law enforcement in Carteret County didn't really have to enforce that law, because the fishermen in Carteret County kind of enforced it themselves, because so many of them were anti-pound net. The guys who were really pro-pound net were the area from areas like Atlantic, Cedar Island, sea level, that area. And they were going up into the Neuse so they could actually use their pound nets. And Carteret County was like, fine, we're turning a blind eye to it as long as it's not in Core Sound, where the folks of Core Sound absolutely hate it. And so here's some data on the expansion of the pound net. Between 1880 and 1896, you have a 1,350% increase of their use on the Neuse River. They start to diminish a little bit in 1904. And as I mentioned, here's some, kind of mentioned a bit of this information already. And as I mentioned already, you know, the Craven County fishermen, you know, they were obeying the law, didn't seem to really be using them that much. Carteret County folks are the ones who were coming up through Clubfoot Creek and Adams Creek primarily to use them. By this time, 1872, you have the creation of Pamlico County. And so by this time, you know, in the 1880s, 1890s, the laws on the Neuse are different, because Craven County says no to pound nets. Pamlico County says yes. So you could fish them around the mouth of the Neuse and along their shoreline in Pamlico, which causes tensions. And so a lot of Carteret County folks are also going into Pamlico County, which Pamlico County fishermen, Carteret County fishermen competing for areas to go fish. It's a little dicey there. People weren't too happy about that. And so here's a map showing you what the area looked like at the time in 1872, up until about 1895, 1896. Things change, and Craven County cedes land to Carteret County, and Carteret County, for the first time, has access to the Neuse River. And so, you know, more opportunities for, you probably already had a lot of Carteret County folks fishing, but now you've opened up just even more opportunity. And you've made the laws more complicated as well, because, you know, but it doesn't seem that Carteret County even then was enforcing the laws on the Neuse. like they were in Core Sound or Bogue Sound. The Poundnets weren't only fishing for shad and herring, although shad made up about 20% of the value of their catch. They're also going for striped bass or rockfish. They're also catching white perch, croaker as well, just to name a few. Then you also had the stake nets, which the majority of these nets were owned by fish dealers and leased to fishermen if they weren't already bought outright. And your average length of your stake net, which is a gill net, which is just anchored in place with wooden stakes, about 20 yards long. And the vast majority of them were being used below New Bern in the wider sections of the Neuse River, although they were being used to an extent above. And about 72 men could fish about 70 stake nets from one boat. So that's a lot. And as you can see, you know, around the turn of the century, there was a ton of stake nets being fished between the mouth of the Neuse River to the area past Kinston up to Contentner Creek. There was a problem with the gill nets on the Neuse, and that was a lot of the fishermen were tying off their stake nets to the Neuse River Bridge. And the reason they were doing this was because there was a problem with boats running over stake nets and tearing them up. And if they, you know, tied off their nets to these sections here, they didn't have to worry about boats running over their nets. Well, the problem also was this bridge is a mile long and they only have a small part right here where fish can actually get through. And so if you have nets going all the way across the river, there's not a whole lot of fish that are going to get above New Bern. Plus, you've got all these fishermen that are above New Bern in the narrow sections of the river with these massive hull seines. They're still using gill nets up there, and other forms of fishing are conducted as well. So there's a lot of pressure being placed on the fish. And so, like I said, most of these gill nets are happening in this section of the river up to this bridge right here. That's where the majority of them are. And then here's a photo that I found, courtesy of the folks at the New Bern Public Library. This is from James City, and you've got this rack right here where you have some nets drying off right here. This would have been, you know, just right across from New Bern. And then I like this photo right here. You've got these racks where you got all these nets drying over here. Meanwhile, you've got this boat right here. This is probably a cunner right here, which is a log boat. When you hear people in discussion in the old sources about canoes, like I said, they're not talking about dugout canoes like Native Americans. They're talking about these multi-log canoe boats, which were extremely popular in eastern North Carolina during, you know, all the way going back to the colonial period, and were used into the early 20th century. But you got this boat right here, which would have fished these nets. And Isaak Lewis, we know that he owned a cunner, and he called his boat Dread, and he was into racing boats on the Neuse River. In the 1870s, you had this sort of kind of yachting or boat racing, not quite yachting as we know it today, but just boat racing was taking place on the Neuse River. A lot of fishermen were racing boats, also a lot of white collar guys, merchants, lawyers, doctors, that kind of thing in New Bern were building their own boats and racing them as well. And this quote here from the New Bernian in 1877 says, Mr. Isaak Lewis with the famous Dread and Mr. Riley Laughing House with a flying curlew head the list of fast canoes, and in the next regatta either sufficient lead should be allowed the canoes to give them a fair chance for the cup, or a separate premium in the race should be arranged. So they need really their own class, their own racing class. Also, that was just a brief kind of interruption segue, but back to gill nets, you have these drift nets, which are unstaked gill nets that are kind of, you got a guys working off of a boat and they're letting these nets drift through the water and fish are getting caught in them. There weren't as many of them being used on the Neuse River. A lot of them are being used below New Bern, and these nets tend to be over 100 yards in length. And I know I've got a lot of quotes, but this is a really nice quote that's actually talks about how these things are used. Every boat used for drift netting contains 2 men, one to throw out and haul in the net and other to row. They divide proceeds as follows. As a rule, that the boat and net belongs to 1 man, so he gets 2 shares. The oarsman gets the other share. 'Tis very interesting now to go up the river just after dark, for on either shore, every quarter of a mile or less, you see large fires burning and hear men singing as they fish. So it's a great picture that the author here has painted us. Not only does he tell us how these nets are being fished and how they're dividing the profits from their fishing, but also this is taking place at night. It's not taking place during daytime. And you got all these bonfires and everyone's just singing as they fish, all these shanties and stuff. And again, it's in this section of the river that this is taking place. And again, drag nets, I've already explained how this net works. There's one source that mentions how the shares are broken up. Captain getting a half share, 2 men getting 1 share. The owner, more than likely a fish dealer, getting 1.5 shares. And something I might not have mentioned before, but you know, these guys are working in the water, waist deep. And during shad season, you know, January to April, that's really cold water. You know, you're getting the 40s, 30s. And it's just unbelievable that these men were going out and doing that kind of hard labor. It really is something else. And these nets are being used all the way from the mouth of the Neuse River, all the way up to an area called Pitch Kettle Landing above New Bern, where you would find these men working them. And another quote, but I like them. It says, other men are using their drag nets and seines. Such boats are used by 5 men, a captain and 4 helpers. Shares are generally divided into 12. The captain, owner of the boat, getting, say, 4 shares, and each helper 2 shares. So these share systems seems like it could vary, you know, from case to case, from crew to crew. It's not a hard and fast rule, it would appear. With these nets and seines, all kinds of fish are caught: cat, eels, bass, robins, redfins, and others. Also, something we haven't talked about are bow nets, which are just giant dip nets that men would have been working out of small boats like canoes or cutters. And they would just put in dipping these giant nets, these dip nets into the river and just scooping out fish. And at one time, there was that many fish in the river where you could just do that. You could just scoop them out. And these nets really did well during high water, during freshets. So when you had a lot of rain and water was just coursing down the Neuse, and there's a lot of debris in the water, you know, a lot of fallen down trees and branches, you can't haul your seines, your whole seines during that time period. And you can't, you know, the branches would foul your gill nets and tear them up. But these guys can go out in their little boats and just dip their nets in the water and scoop out fish during those times. And you really see them in the area up around below Goldsboro, you know, that sort of section of the river is where you see a lot of them. But as you see with, you know, all these examples, whether they're, you know, hull seines, gill nets, bow nets, you know, the numbers are falling on them as we go from, you know, the late 1890s into the early 1900s. And there's a reason for that. But again, these bow nets, before I get into that, are used from the mouth. A lot of them are used around Pitch Kettle Landing, but most of them are used in this section right here of the Neuse, around Goldsboro, Kinston area. Okay, so with all these nets and all this fish being caught, and you know, fewer and fewer people being able to fish because there's not as much fish to go around, the state had a panic in the 1870s and said, and the federal government as well, and said, we've got to save the American shad on the rivers and the sounds of North Carolina. And so what they decided to do are set up shad hatcheries where they gather, where they're basically growing baby shad. You know, you get the eggs and you fertilize them and you grow them in jars, and then you release them into the rivers that way. To try to bring back the populations. I forgot to mention earlier in the talk, shad and herring, they're anadromous fish, which basically means they'll spend most of their lives out in salt water out in the ocean, but they come back in the fresh water. They go up in the creeks and rivers to reproduce. But the first experiments with the shad hatcheries on the Neuse were in the early mid 1870s by the federal government. They didn't get the results that they wanted on the Neuse River. I think it was the freshets was causing problems for them, sweeping away the fry. But so the federal government decides to set up operation on the Albemarle Sound, where they have these massive whole seine fisheries that are collecting shad. And they partner with these seine fishermen to gather the roe and to fertilize them. And so they have these hatcheries. The federal government only had temporary hatcheries in the 1870s and the 1880s. These came in the form of steamships. You had the Lookout and the Fish Hawk, which were owned by the federal government, by the Fish Commission. Anyways, and these jars right here, this is where they're breeding fish. And from 1878, 1885, North Carolina gets into this, effort to save the shad. And by 1882, North Carolina is on the cutting edge in terms of fish culture technology, this artificial propagation of the shad. Unfortunately, they decide to defund the program in 1885, which was probably a big mistake. And they say, we're just going to let the federal government and the counties kind of deal with this. Unfortunately, the federal government wasn't able to establish a permanent hatchery on the Albemarle Sound until 1900 when they put one in Edenton. That was too little too late. They weren't getting enough in the 1890s, and in the early 1900s, there's a drop-off, severe drop-off in the number of fish being released into the rivers. And in the Neuse, it was hundreds of thousands of fry that they're releasing into that river. And this is one of the whole seine fisheries on the Albemarle Sound that the federal government was partnered with, and they were taking the roe out of the female shad for their program. And this is one of these sort of little hatcheries right here. It's just a small experimental station. And so in 1880 to 1896, the shad population grew in North Carolina due to this artificial propagation and releasing fish into the rivers. But by 1904, the shad populations quickly diminished because you had too many people and too many nets fishing for this fish, and they're catching them faster than they could replace them in North Carolina. And so ultimately, the species has gone into decline and is no longer caught commercially in North Carolina. This fish was so important. It was valued at 30% of the total, value of the state's landings, commercial landings for food fish. And all of a sudden it's gone. Or it gradually went away, but it was felt when it was gone. And so here's a graph. There's a lot of missing data points because, let's face it, people weren't, gathering data consistently during this time period. But, we can see the shad landings in North Carolina being low in 1880, but rising through the 1880s and 1890s due to artificial propagation, and then kind of falling off. And then, as you can see by this one, it's the greens indicated by gill nets. The gill nets are really dominating this fishery. And there's thousands of them in the Neuse, as we saw earlier, and there's tens of thousands of them throughout North Carolina. And you know, the Poundnet really starts to become somewhat dominant, not nearly as much as the Gill Net, but overtakes the whole seines in the towards the turn of the century and after. And so I wanted to sort of conclude this again with Isaak Lewis, because, you know, this is sort of the world that he lived in. He died in 1895. And so he would have been there at the very beginning of the commercial fishing industry on the Neuse, and he would have seen the American shad fishery come to its peak. And, you know, maybe fortunately he died and before he saw the collapse of that fishery. But that's the fishery that would have produced the majority of his wealth. It would have paid for the house that his family lived in. It would have been the fish that put the clothes on his family's back. It's what employed his sons initially, although his sons ultimately got out of the commercial fishing industry in the late 19th century. James, the Confederate veteran that we talked about earlier, went on to become a policeman and eventually become the chief of police for the city of New Bern. He had other sons that went into other maritime trades, just not fishing. But here's the reason why, one of the reasons why, again, we know so much about this guy, and it's because of this lawsuit regarding Mary Frances, his ship. And it was in 1877 that they put in a claim, his family put in a claim against the federal government regarding the loss of this vessel for $2,000. And it wasn't until a year after he died in 1896 that it was finally settled for $740. And the lawyer working the case took home half, $370. And the money from that settlement, plus whatever sort of savings were left in from the sale of his home, was just enough to pay off his debts when he passed away. But he was noted in his obituary as being one of New Bern's oldest citizens and an upright and honorable man. And so this is sort of, this you know, talk's been a little bit different than what I usually do. So I've tried to paint you all a picture of what the Neuse River fisheries looked like in the 19th century, kind of from the sort of using the lens of this one man's life, this fisherman. So I hope you all had enjoyed the talk. If you have any questions, you know, let me know and I'll take them now.
Nets that were 1,000 yards long, is that a series of nets?
It's one net, one continuous net. And a lot of those nets, they originated, that style of fishing originated out of the Albemarle Sound region of North Carolina. So the question's about whole seines. Sorry for the folks online. Was it a series of nets or one continuous nets for the big ones, the 1,000, 1,500 yard ones? And it's one seine, and that style of fishing in North Carolina came out of the Albemarle Sound. It's imported by the Felton family to the Neuse River. And those nets tend to be, traditionally they're tarred to maintain them, to preserve them in the water. And it was very costly fishery. I mean, the nets were very expensive. You had to clear your shoreline. You couldn't have any snags in the water or on your shoreline that would tear. It's a very expensive net. A lot of manpower was involved. One of the fisheries that I talked about early in the antebellum section had 30 men working that one fishery. And for some of the fisheries on the Albemarle Sound, you had a couple that had nets that were more than 2 miles or more in length. We have a much larger body of water, and their labor force was larger. On the Albemarle after the Civil War in the 1870s, the nets got to be so big that they were using steam engines to haul them in. There were these steam-powered winches that would that would wind in these giant ropes. They're called warps. Or the lines are attached to the warps. But anyways, they haul these giant ones in under steam power. And they also had steamboats up on the Albemarle, small steamboats that were putting the net out into the sound. They didn't have anything like that on the Neuse. What they're using with these big hull seines on the Neuse to pull them in are horses, mules, donkeys, that kind of thing. So a lot of times when a fishery is up for sale or a fishery's gone bankrupt and it's being auctioned off, not only are you seeing boats, nets being sold, but you're also tend to see horses or mules or donkeys. And those tended to be working, they would walk, the horses or mules would be walking in a circle, and you'd have a windlass that they were winding, and that was, you know, winding up your rope, pulling it in the shore a lot of times.
During the middle of the 19th century and a lot of that period of time in that century, there were intermittent panics, bank panics, and bank economic distress. Did you happen to take a look to see whether or not the fisheries, did that correlate with downtimes in the due to the banking? Or was it independent of that?
It doesn't seem to have affected those panics. Don't seem to have affected those particular fisheries that I've seen. It may have for some people who had, you know, money tied up in the stock market. Where I have seen it very explicitly with how bank panics or recessions or depressions affect commercial fishing, and that's in the menhaden industry. Very, you know, expensive in terms of, you know, capital, and those factories, if you have a recession or bank panic, a lot of those factories would go under. That's actually something I talked about in one of my last talks on the menhaden industry of the Lower Cape Fear. I mentioned there being recessions and bank panics that caused those fisheries to go out of business. But then also during those time periods, you would have people who had money to invest, you know, and they could buy cheap as well during those periods. So any more questions? All right, well, thank you all very much.